My name is Friedrik Lundin, not Friedrik Lundin, as it said on the slide ahead of me. I work for ISS Climate, which is the climate arm of Institutional Shareholder Services. We are the only ESG provider with a fully fledged climate unit. So what we do, the kind of pathway that we work accordingly is understand, measure, and act. So basically understand how our clients are affected by the climate in their investments and how their investments are affected by the climate. We then help them measure that impact and then act upon it. And that, in brief, is I and ISS Climate.
So, my name's Tony Rooke. I'm Technical Director at CDP. Anybody heard of CDP? Good. Okay.
Can I ask an additional question? Has anyone ever heard of ISS? Okay, that's nice.
Okay. Thank you also for playing. We now have the interaction going. This is going to be encouraged as we go. Just for those of you that don't know us, we have over 650 investors representing about $87 trillion in managed assets, on behalf of whom we actually ask cities, states, and regions and companies what they are doing on climate, deforestation, and water security. Last year, we had 7,000 companies, over 7,000 companies disclosing to us globally, up from 6,300. We had 620 cities, and we had 120 states and regions. And an important thing that we did last year was we integrated the recommendations on the Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Sorry, I've got a little bit of a cold, and it's taken me 2 months to practice saying Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, and then the cold comes along. We have some questions for you. How many of you have actually, first of all, how many of you are from investing companies, investor organizations? So about 3 or 4, 5, 5.5, 5.25, 3/4. How many of you are from reporting companies, from organizations, profit organizations? Where the hell do the rest of you all come from? How many of you from governments? How many of you from NGOs? Okay, still needing some more information in the room. But thank you very much for that. There weren't that many companies putting their hands up that have reported, but how many of you have actually reported on the TCFD recommendations? None of you. Okay, that's good. We know where we're starting from here. The second question is now redundant because we can't say, those of you who have actually reported on this topic. But anyway, what we want to achieve is to give you an idea of what the TCFD is about, an overview of the concept of scenario analysis, which is the principal thing that the Financial Stability Board's Taskforce on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, see, I can say it quick, came out with. That was the real key thing, as well as into mainstream reporting. And show that an initial scenario analysis for a company doesn't have to be complicated. Believe me, it can get that way, but you can start simple. So, I'm going to give you a background on the TCFD. It was initially created by the Financial Stability Board. Basically, Mark Carney, Mike Bloomberg came together and said, right, we need to do something about this. Mark Carney, who was chairman of the Financial Stability Board and also chairman of the Bank of England, in September 2015, put together his speech at the Mansion House, saying that the economic failure of the market in delivering a stable climate worldwide is because of a tragedy of horizons. The fact that the financing of industry, the financing of the economy, doesn't look too far enough ahead to take into account these risks. And that's really where this was born. It's responsible for developing voluntary recommendations on what companies should report on climate-related issues. And it's really to get this integrated into mainstream reports. It's not actually so that the reports themselves are integrated per se, but that actually the thinking behind it within companies should be integrated. That climate-related issues shouldn't be an ivory tower subject for a separate sustainability department. It should be integrated into both the financial planning, the risk analysis, the opportunity analysis, and the strategy of the business. And it was made up of 32 members across 20 countries. An industry-led initiative, so NGOs by and large were not allowed to participate, certainly weren't allowed membership of this, so it was driven by industry. It principally came up with 4 key recommendations, or 4 key categories. The fact that companies should disclose and be transparent on what their governance of the issues, where in the organization are climate-related issues taken to. Is it at board level? Is it below board level? And who is managing that? Is it a committee through the Risk and Audit Committee? Also, second thing is strategy. How are climate-related issues influencing your business? Are they making you change the direction that you're actually taking your business strategy? Or is it business as usual? Also, third one, risk management. This is very much at the heart of what the TCFD is trying to do with the tragedy of horizons. It's trying to actually get companies to understand this is an inherent risk, an intrinsic risk, and be able to collect that also so that we can assess it as other stakeholders, say governments or investment managers, as an intrinsic risk to a portfolio or to a country or even to the globe. And the final thing that actually it asked for was performance metrics and targets for actually making that performance work. Particularly things like greenhouse gas inventories, Scope 1, Scope 2, Scope 3, but also what targets are the companies setting to reduce those. And it can be on energy as well as climate related. So, the recommendations themselves, there are some recommended disclosures, and they also produce some guidance, both across all industries, all sectors, as I said here, but also some supplemental guidance for key high-impact industries. As you can see, there are actually 22 sectors that they targeted with this supplementary guidance, and they are roughly divided into the financial and the non-financial world. So those outliers of, or providers of capital, whether they're banking, insurance companies, asset owners, asset managers, and those companies that operationally generate emissions through their activities. And these were divided into energy groups, producing either fossil fuels or producing energy itself, transportation, the makers of transportation vehicles, but also the operators of those vehicles, industries producing materials or actually making buildings, so real estate management, development, for example, but also things like cement, steel. And finally, agriculture. And agriculture, I think, is really rocketing up the scale in actually the focus on climate. The IPCC report with the 1.5 degree very much highlighted the fact that we are going to need to change our diets, which means big agriculture is going to actually have to change what it actually supplies if we're to meet a 1.5 degree target, which is going to be very challenging. And just so you know, I've been reducing my own meat intake as well because of this. I never thought I'd go vegan, but I'm getting close. So there's been a lot of corporate adoption. We've had over 100 companies say they will actually adopt this into their mainstream reports. Sorry, that's 100 CEOs that have actually said that. 500 plus companies have actually committed to do this. And 18 companies have committed to implementing this in their mainstream reports through the CDSB's commitment, which is the Climate Disclosure Standards Board. For those of you that don't go in this world that often, reporting is all about acronym soup. So there's lots of letters. Apologies if we use lots. Please put your hand up if you want an acronym explained. I'll try to. We've also had 130 investors that represent over $30 trillion worth of assets under management that have also backed this. There's been governments trying to adopt this as well. Sweden and France have committed to implement them. The UK government has publicly welcomed them, although perhaps hasn't gone as far as actually saying it's going to actually implement them. There's a UK-China pilot project for financial institutional disclosure, and that's a really key development that's going forward, actually getting financial institutions to report on where their capital is going rather than how green their data center is and how green their building is. Canada is also doing work, and as you've heard from members of the panel in the first session, there is a high-level expert group looking at this across the EU as well, particularly on sustainable finance. Lots of other initiatives, the Sustainable Stock Exchange Initiative, Climate Action 100, the Investor Agenda, and the UK Green Finance Taskforce are all also pushing for TCFD to be adopted by companies and used as their reporting recommendations, and not necessarily as that's the maximum they've got to do, as the minimum they have to do. CDP operates questionnaires every year where we ask these, over 7,000 companies have actually responded to it, and we've actually integrated the TCFD recommendations into it. All right, I'm going to give you 5 more seconds, and I'm going to test you on this chart. No, I'm not, don't worry, I'm not, because I won't know the answers either. No. We've integrated it into our questionnaire. So this has been at the heart of actually something that we've been working to over the last year and a half, supported by EIT and Climate-KIC, so thank you to them as well, to get it into our questionnaires. And as I said, my colleague, my fellow speaker, is going to talk a lot more about scenario analysis. That's actually one of the things that came in under strategy. Under the TCFD recommendations, and it's at the heart of what's happening. And it's been quite eye-opening to see some of the responses so far. I can't talk about them all because we have to publish our results, but some companies are doing this already, not enough. Going forward, we've currently implemented at CDP 16 of the 22 TCFD sectors. And we're planning by the end of next year to integrate all 22 sectors into our questionnaires. It's quite a big job. We've had 500,000 downloads of our guidance this year from people and companies. We've also had well over 1,500 downloads of our specific technical notes on TCFD and scenario analysis. And we've also helped to inform the recent report on adoption of TCFD so far. That report came out in September. Key findings are that the majority of big organizations already disclose to the majority of TCFD recommendations, which is great news. To Sasha's comment about we need to get the top 100 reporting and disclosing and actually transforming. Well, most of those are already doing it. But, there is a big but there, not a lot of them are actually disclosing what the real financial implications are to them. And that's still some way to go. And then the information on where the strategy lands itself after they've done climate-related scenarios is limited, as well as what goes into those scenarios. There are differences depending on groups. The fossil fuel groups tend to do a lot more on scenario analysis. They're prepared for that, the fossil fuel industries, and have been disclosing more on that because there's been more demand on them and also because they're, by and large, the first at risk from this. But often that disclosure is in multiple reports and distributed in multiple ways, so it's very difficult for investors to get hold of that information. And that's one of the key things that CDP we've tried to do, is actually bring that together into one place, structured in the same format, so investors can compare. So that's a whistle-stop tour through TCFD. Any questions that came out of that? Yes. I'll say your question and I'll repeat it so everybody can hear.
Sure. Could you talk more about what the financial sector have to disclose? They have to disclose, say, the emissions of the companies that they invest in, or their own direct impact? And also, could you talk a bit more about the UK-China pilot project? You mentioned there about they have to disclose the assets that they invest in.
So the question is, can we talk a bit more about what the TCFD has asked financial sector to disclose, and what a bit more detail about the UK-China Green Finance Initiative. It's still underway. I'll just go back to, where did we come to? Here. So all the sectors have to disclose to the same sort of format, whether they're financial or non-financial. But the shift for TCFD is trying to get the financial organizations to not disclose necessarily on how green their data center is, how green their buildings are. They've done fabulous work on that, and I'm not knocking it, but where their assets are actually going, where their financial assets are going. But more importantly, because a lot of the metrics for that aren't exactly set up yet and aren't agreed, they're taking a higher level view, which is actually looking at, okay, so what governance do you have in place into managing your financial products, for designing your financial products? What risk management process do you have in assessing your portfolio? I know Friedrik's going to go into scenario analysis at detail for financial services, so I'm not going to go too much into the strategy side. I think that's where he should go. But that's really where it's coming from. The metrics, I would say, for financial institutions, if we're honest, are still not quite there. There are some there. I know Jakob's in the audience as well, and we've had lots of debates about whether they should disclose a scope 1 of their portfolio, or scope 2, and it's not going to be the metric. It's not really a very accurate metric, but it will have to be a starting place of disclosing some sort of footprinting as those metrics develop. And I know ISS and others, like 2 Degree Investing, are looking at actually how do we get to grips with the portfolio, the metrics that need to really be disclosed on this.
And I mean, just to add to that, I mean, one of the reasons of scenario analysis is to kind of look at the variety of metrics that are required, or that the financial industry can use to disclose their impact, and then sort of combining them into something useful. So that, of course, includes the emissions, but also sort of overall strategy and risk exposure.
Yes, gentleman here.
Thank you. My question was about the metrics and when are we arriving at some globally accepted metrics, but I think you have answered, and the question is that we are not there yet. And just popped into my mind watching and looking at the sectors, the non-financial sectors. I'm not sure where you would put shipping, maritime shipping, and I'm also sure where you would put a company like Apple or Google or somebody who's mining crypto coin for example. That would be financial.
So if I just get clear on the final bit, where does a company like Apple, that's increasingly going into being sort of a service that's a financial service, play? It's a really interesting point. The first question was about metrics. The one thing I didn't say in that we are also looking at how we can define standards on what we call scope 3 emissions, the financed impact, and that's really sort of an area of exploration at the moment, and also part of what we're trying to explore for the UK-China relationship as well, which is really looking at how banks in China and then other non-financial institutions can disclose to TCFD, given the fact that a lot of disclosure in China isn't pushed through the investor route. It's more dictated to from the government route. I'm not sure I caught what the maritime question was. Shipping.
You have air freight, airlines, and you have a category it's called marine. Does this include kinds of commercial shipping?
Yes, absolutely. The marine sector in the here. This is trying to capture pretty much most modes of transport. The one that's probably not captured there is space at the moment, but it's not really that big an issue at the moment. But yeah, it's very much trying to get into that, but also not just the service operators, but also the construction of it.
And the other was about communication, ICT. Amazon, Apple, Walt Disney, the biggest companies of our...
Yeah, the way that we actually delineate this, the TCFD had to do a focus. I had to look at certain sectors, and it was looking at primarily which are the sectors that are having the highest impact from a climate point of view, rather than necessarily which sectors can have the most influence going forward. There's a new standard coming out where we're part of a World Benchmarking Alliance, where we're trying to actually understand the biggest sectors that can have the influence and actually producing a benchmark report for those. And it's across all 17 SDGs, and obviously climate's one of them, and that's where CDP are taking a lead. We're looking at 13 sectors, and one of those is ICT. SDGs, Sustainable Development. Oh, no, World Benchmarking Alliance. Yeah. So there's a gentleman behind you now.
Thanks so much. Daniel Brooksbank from Responsible Investor. We're talking a lot about analysis, but not a lot about scenarios. What scenario are we talking about here? How do you base your scenario? What is the central scenario that you use?
That is that's what I'm going to talk about fairly soon. I don't know if we have any other questions, but that sounds like a fantastic lead-in to me.
I agree.
Maybe we can move some slides around. I think before we start talking about scenario analysis, I was thinking that most of you, or none of you, had reported to the CDP. How many of you have conducted scenario analysis? Not just climate-based, by the way. Any type of scenario analysis can be included. Okay, fantastic. So you know a little bit about it. How many find scenario analysis confusing? How many of you think that I am holding the mic too close to my face? Yeah. Two people. Okay. So is this better? I don't...
No, it's closer.
This is better? Okay, I'm sorry. I'm not used to handhelds. So what do we talk about when we talk about scenario analysis? Okay, this is perhaps not the slide I was expecting. But that's absolutely fine, of course. Is this version 2? Well, then I must have sent you the wrong slides. Well, yeah, no. But hey, let's focus on the one that says temperature pathways, okay? Basically, the purpose of scenario analysis is basically viewing it as a tool to analyze possible futures by examining alternative possible outcomes. Now, this means it can mean a variety of things in a variety of sciences and industries. It's an extraordinarily common tool, as you already showed us by raising your hands. And if we look at these temperature pathways right here, what we see is a variety of climate change scenarios in relation to different climate policies, right? And if we look at the black line, we see the historic emissions. If we look at the orange line, we see what climate change can be if there are no climate policies. If we look at the blue line, we see what is required for us to reach a 1.5 degree pathway. And from a scenario perspective, for an investor, I should say, but I think this also applies to corporates, we can sort of imagine us standing on that black line and saying, okay, are our investments aligned with the orange line, the green line, the purple line, the red line, or the blue line? And depending on what it is aligned with, what does that mean for us from a risk perspective? So transitional risks and physical risks. So this is something that we'll talk a little about later. I think what's important also to mention when we're talking about scenario analysis is that we are very much dealing in hypotheticals. We are not expecting this to be an exact science, but we are expecting it to be sort of indicative of where an investor, a company, an asset is going. What Tony talked a little bit about earlier was the TCFD status report that came out in September, showing that most actors that disclose do not disclose on scenario analysis. I think this can be for a couple of different reasons. Many, of course, find it confusing. The TCFD themselves, I would say, are sort of fairly kind in their expectations, at least their initial expectations, that they're kind of asking you to consider or providing a discussion considering how your investments could be affected by different scenarios. That could mean pretty much anything. And that's kind of what I want to show you here today as well, to kind of show that to start doing a scenario analysis doesn't necessarily have to be very difficult. There are many different ways of doing it. It's great to get started as soon as possible. But this has, of course, led to some criticism, the sort of the varieties of disclosure that we've seen so far. I think just last month we got some criticism from the CEO of BP, basically saying that this hinders investors in decision making. We've also received some criticism, or I suppose, climate change scenario analysis has received some criticism for being confusing. I think this is to be expected. This happens pretty much every time some new form of sustainability or climate disclosure metric is presented to the market. People will accuse it of being confusing. And also sort of the shape of the disclosure we've seen these past couple of years, or not these past couple of years, this past year, many different methods, many different reports, generally reports put together by people that aren't necessarily used to doing this type of climate change analysis for an audience that isn't necessarily used to reading it. But I think with regards to the critique of this sort of hindering investment decisions, I think that is quite blatantly false, because there are a few things that we do know, of course, and I think everyone in this room more or less agrees with that. If you don't agree, I think say nothing. I think that's best, because I don't think we have time for that conversation right now. But the climate is rapidly changing. This will be reflected in the physical and policy environment. We see evidence of that every day. And if you are a responsible investor, you should take this into consideration in your decision-making process. And for this, scenario analysis is an absolutely excellent tool, I think, both for investors and for corporates, for a variety of reasons, but I think the main reason is that it forces you, both as an investor and as a corporate, to contextualize the work that you're doing, right? We used to be, you could say, okay, this is my scope 1, this is my scope 2, in 2025 I will reduce my emissions by 5%, right? And then you'd be, okay, that's great. But what does that mean? That means nothing really, I think, from a climate change perspective. And this kind of forces you to say why you've made decisions that you've made, why you're disclosing the way that you're doing. And I think that's a fantastic tool. So, scenario analysis, how to approach the topic. So I think this matrix contains quite a lot of jargon. It can probably add to the confusion that some of you are already feeling. But it all kind of boils down to the fundamentals of how and what. So basically, what do I want to analyze and how do I want to analyze it? So what we kind of looking at the type of disclosure that we've seen in the market lately are talking about an impact-oriented approach and a risk-oriented approach. So the impact-oriented approach focusing mainly on aligning your portfolio with different emission scenarios. Generally, the scenarios that you're going to be choosing are the ones focusing on a 1.5 to a 2 degree pathway. This can be done in a few different ways. For example, if you're talking about emissions, you can look at the emissions intensity of your portfolio companies, and you see how your portfolio is aligned with various scenarios. So that kind of disclosure metric is in there. Another way to do more of a qualitative analysis is to look at the product portfolio of your company. This is a product that we have developed with regards to SDG alignment relating to climate change. Basically doing, a basic qualitative analysis of your holdings to see if the products that they are offering are aggravating climate change. So let's say that you're dealing with extractives or fossil fuel companies. They have a net impact, natural gas, some consumer goods, or if you are contributing to reaching climate goals through your products. So renewable energy, insulation, energy efficiency, that sort of thing, right? So this gives you a kind of an overview of what you can accomplish. And generally, which I think is an add-on, so when you're looking at a company's product portfolio, is that obviously you don't just want to be invested in companies that are being profitable now. You want companies that have products that remain relevant in a transition economy, in a 2-degree economy. And I think you kind of want to highlight that. And secondly, I mean, when we're talking now, we're talking a lot about low carbon funds, we're talking about sustainable impact funds, impact investing, that sort of thing. And impact investing is not just making sure that your carbon footprint is fairly low right now, it's also making sure that you're sort of contributing to a positive development of the market and the world economy, I would argue. Secondly, we have the risk-oriented approach. So this focuses more on risk exposure rather than alignment. You look at your holdings, you're saying, okay, how can climate change negatively affect my portfolio? This can, of course, be done in a variety of ways. We're looking more into climate risk later and looking more at physical risk exposure. But as an example, once again, using the greenhouse gas emissions data, either estimated or provided by a corporate, and looking at the alignment with different carbon pricing scenarios, you can look at what potential financial risks a carbon pricing scheme would have, right? So basically doing projections about the trajectory of the companies in your portfolio, looking at the risk exposure in relation to geography and the implementation of carbon pricing schemes will give you, I think, a pretty good idea. And then, okay, I think I'm just going to go back to this slide. Because the point I wanted to make is, when we get to the how, so there are a lot of choices that you kind of have to make. Do you want to use qualitative or quantitative data? Do you want to do top-down or bottom-up? I mean, it kind of depends on the size of your portfolio, the type of holdings that you're invested in. But I think the most important things that you have to consider are the reference scenarios that you're using and the time horizon that you're looking at, right? So reference scenarios, as you asked earlier, is kind of one of the most basic ones. So what scenario is it that I'm doing my scenario analysis accordingly, right? The slide that we're looking at right now, these are the scenarios from the International Energy Agency for 2 degrees, 4 degrees, 6 degrees. These have been slightly manipulated by me, and I'll explain it, or my team, but I'll explain how later. But the point that I wanted to make is, if we look at this 2-degree slide, or picture here on the left, we're seeing a slight increase of emissions over shorter periods of time, yes? So if you would do a scenario analysis where you're looking at the coming 5 years, let's say, or 3 years, or whatever you want to do, it might look like your portfolio is aligned, but if you extend that trajectory 10 or 15 years, you might notice that it is not. Secondly, when it comes to your choice of scenarios, you have to take into consideration that some will include, assume that there will be quite a lot of natural gas, for example, or rely quite a lot on nuclear power. Some will have technologies in there that some may consider aren't completely finalized yet, like carbon capture and storage, for example, right? Whereas some other scenarios will not take that in, or will assume that if the technology doesn't exist today, it will not exist tomorrow, and therefore we cannot assume that we can use it when we're doing our scenario analysis. So that's the kind of the points I wanted to make in the how. I deeply apologize that I have the wrong slideshow, and I'm 100% my fault, but the point I wanted to make, and I can guide you towards the thought piece we put together on scenario analysis later, is that there are a variety or a number of investors that have gone public with their scenario analysis during these past years, and choosing a variety of approaches. Some will be impact-oriented, some are risk-oriented, and they are available online, and I will do my best to send you that list. Any questions? First, I'd like to ask this. Does anyone still find scenario analysis confusing? Only 3 people. That's fantastic. Any questions? Yes?
Well, I have a question. It's not only related to this, but also, well, to the overall presentation. I am from the Green Climate Fund. I work at the Africa desk. So my question is on geography. If we can go back to the map of those countries or institutions that are using the TCFD. So I was wondering, taking into account the comments that have been done, have searched in the previous discussion, that we want to be inclusive if we really want to change on climate. We can't just be a club of clean countries or entities. And especially as I work at the Africa desk, I see Africa is absolutely empty. So I'm wondering how we could team up to find solutions and make sure that more and more parties over the world are involved in this process to make sure it's not mainly European or Anglo-Saxon, but also, covering the rest of cultures. At the Green Climate Fund, we have an accreditation procedure to involve partners in our investment channels. I think there should be some teaming up in checking the criteria, because if parties are aligned with the TCFD or are starting to get involved, then it means that they cover the criteria more or less that the GCF is requiring from accredited entities. So I think there are many synergies, and also with the scenario analysis, because all countries, hey, don't leave. He's leaving, he's not listening.
Fred.
Sorry, I don't know. All countries, all developing countries, so 145 countries are required to do a country program for the GCF, which starts with a scenario analysis for their development strategy. So should be happy. It's a big club of of members or clients or parties to work with. But well, at this moment, there is no relationship. So I wonder how we can start,
so
putting people
in short,
to
the
work
question
together.
is how do we do things that isn't just Europe,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
North America, and maybe a bit of Asia? It's a really good point, and I agree. The TCFD itself was set up without representation from Africa. I don't think there's a little bit of representation from South America. It tended to come from where the biggest financial asset owner markets were or are. We do have, through CDP, obviously we have a way for companies to disclose, and we have quite a lot of South African companies disclosing to us, because they tend to be a bit more market capitalized to that point, but also throughout Africa as well. But I don't have a magic answer. I think it's a very good point, and we need to do some ways to actually get companies disclosing there as well. So yes, and to also see the relevance for these markets. But what we found as we've gone out globally is it hits the markets in different ways, but actually I think what everybody is looking for is a standardized way to get this off the ground, but not necessarily as this is, once we've achieved reporting through TCFD, then we've fixed climate. It's let's get everybody to a certain minimum standard, and then we can progress from there, because at the moment, as we heard in the panel before, the challenge is not actually that the leaders aren't and the progressive companies aren't doing not just the disclosure, but the action behind it. The challenge is that not everybody is doing this, and there's still a bunch of big bunch of companies that need to actually be brought forward into a low carbon transition if we've got any hope of making a 1.5 or even a 2 degree world.
And also sort of adding on to that, if you want to, adding when I'm talking about sort of how scenario analysis forces you to contextualize the work that you are doing, that also means that you have to have a better idea of your value chain, your partners, your markets, which kind of forces you to look perhaps more towards regions that you haven't looked at before. Yeah.
Thank you. Jacob Tomei from the 2 Degrees Investing Initiative. Tony kindly name-dropped our organization in the context of portfolio carbon footprinting. I do want to flag that there's pretty significant evidence that portfolio carbon footprinting is not a sensible exercise. And I think for those folks in the room who are kind of getting the impression that this is a necessary exercise, I want to push back on that. I understand it's not necessarily the discussion right now, but I encourage you all to reflect on this and not just assume that just because emissions are causing climate change that a portfolio footprinting is the way forward. I mean, UNEP-FI and WRI and organizations like ours have done a lot of work to show that actually it isn't, and I just want to flag that. I think the other thing is, Friedrik, I liked how you pointed into the impact-risk dichotomy, but I think it needs to go even deeper, because the first question in scenario analysis should really be, what are you trying to do?
Yeah, and sort of the objective of the analysis.
Yeah,
We'll talk a little bit about that later, yeah. No, I certainly agree with you when it comes to greenhouse gas accounting that it's not necessarily a panacea. I think we like to use it as a primary indicator for whether or not you see climate change as a topic that you sort of is relevant for you. And then, of course, the numbers do not necessarily exist in a vacuum. If you want to look at the energy efficiency, resource efficiency, etc. of a company, you have to compare it with other companies. And I think greenhouse gas accounting is a fairly good tool to do that. But of course, other metrics are also necessary.
Thank you. I was wondering, I'm doing research on sustainable value added and like financial implications of climate-related disclosure and sustainability reporting. So as you noticed, mainly that the financial implications are not disclosed by companies, and how the climate-related disclosure, financial disclosure, right, will promote or will improve that. Because that will be really, really great to see as investors are looking at returns and risks, right? So to see the financial implications and cash flow, profits, costs, how the investment made in companies mainly is bringing the positive value for investors later.
That works if you go a little further. So.
Yes, it works over here. That's really weird. I have to go into a corner to actually answer a question. This is why I wanted you to come with me. Okay, but I can't cross this line. Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point. How do we get more financial disclosures? Is it early days? No, in some respects it is early days. This is the first time we've been trying to get organizations to do this on climate-related. Well, I say first time with the backing of an organization like the TCFD and how that's come into effect, and with the kudos it has from the Financial Stability Board. We've been asking for risk assessment and financial implications through CDP for a number of years, and trying to incentivize companies to actually disclose on that through our scoring system about transparency, and then that leads to leadership. Part of the reason why it's not disclosed very well is there has to be shown that there is a demand for it, and companies aren't uniformly getting that message. We say that investors want to use this metric to go forward and need it, but at the same time I feel they're not hearing it every time, and they're probably not hearing it in the CFO discussion. They're hearing it in the ESG discussion perhaps, but not necessarily in the CFO discussion. The second point is a lot of companies that we found actually aren't doing scenario analysis or aren't doing it particularly quantitatively. So therefore, they haven't actually got results that they're willing to disclose if they've got those results. And that's part of the issue, is getting through that sort of minefield of what can they disclose? What can they actually say about a forward-looking metric that's financial? Because it isn't necessarily, you can't necessarily get it validated, verified, assured, or anything else like that, because it's a forward, it's a projection. But I think it's about getting into that comfort zone, and at the moment, many companies aren't in that comfort zone, but they're getting used to the process. And that's something that we found from a lot of years of asking companies. We define what the problem is, we define what should be expected, and over years, companies get used to this. Now, I know we have the urgency, and we need to know this sooner, and we need to get going on it sooner, but that's what we're trying to do at the moment, and I think it's about behoving on all of us to sort of push that forward.
Hans Andersen from Aarhus University. I have one question for each of you. The first to you, Tony. What about Scope 3 in the TCFD? Because I've certainly seen, of course, Scope 1 and 2 being included, but I'm actually not sure about Scope 3. And also, in the Scope 3, you know, how do you include like negative emissions? So if you have a hybrid car, for instance, that carries a big CO2 footprint in its production, but that has a lower in its usage, or if you have a detergent that uses an enzyme that therefore the consumer uses less energy in heating the water, how is that captured in the TCFD as it stands right now? So that's the first question. And then to Friedrik, could you elaborate on the pros and cons of TCFD setting up some baselines for the reference points for the scenario analysis, like you showed with the trajectories for the energy section? So there are different scenarios, and there are discussions that they should come up with specific sectors, some baseline scenarios that all companies in that sector could work from. What's the pros and cons of doing that or not doing that?
I'll answer the first question first. Scope 3, no, you're right, it's not mandated in that. I absolutely agree. It has to be something that companies disclose, and actually probably say, we can disclose this amount, 70% of our Scope 3 we can actually measure, and the other we have to estimate, and be transparent about that, because it is a lot of work to actually pull that value through. But it's also? It's also the biggest. Yes, and for many companies, Scope 3 is the biggest. So we do try and pull that through in our CDP Questionnaire as well, and model it as well. And I think this also goes back to a previous question as well. On the reference scenarios, there is no sort of absolute, you must do this reference scenario, that reference scenario. To be honest, most of the climate-related scenarios, there aren't like industry-specific ones, or not all industries are covered by a scenario, not all geographies are covered by a scenario, or can be drilled down to. So I think the TCFD struggled to be able to actually come out with and say, you must do this. What I think that should translate into is the fact that actually a scenario analysis isn't a predictive instrument of this is what your company will turn out to be. It is a method of seeing what situation might arise that could potentially financially impact your organization to the point of either it manages to grow exponentially, or to the other extreme where actually it ceases to exist because of a certain constraints. Like if a carbon price went over $150 or $200, at what point does the company break? But it isn't necessarily saying this is how the company will go in the future. It is there to be a tool. And when I speak to investors about what they want to see, what I hear is we'd like everybody to be tested against one type of scenario, and then we want a specific scenario that would be actually more applicable to your organization. So, for example, insurance companies, it makes more sense to see how resilient they are to a 4-degree scenario. If you look at the Association of British Insurers, they basically said, from their point of view, a 4-degree world is uninsurable. and so they go out of business from that point of view. So for insurance, it makes sense to look at 4 degrees. I think, testing the resilience of your company, if your company can still survive on a 1.5 degree scenario with the technology assumptions and everything else within that and flourish, then it's probably an indication that actually that company will do well in the low carbon transition. Sorry, I know I've gone into your space a bit there, but...
A little bit, yes, I suppose. I think it was absolutely beautifully put, and I certainly think that he said, I think, more or less everything that needs to be said. I mean, but if we're talking about positives and negatives, I mean, I think, not speaking for the TCFD in general, but I think that they do not, I mean, okay, I guess when they ask for scenario analysis, they are fairly specific in the requests, but they don't really want to paint the investor into a corner. I mean, they want to let them sort of understand the methods and the approaches that works best for them. And if that is what you're doing, then, it's difficult to provide specific scenarios, because then you really have to provide a number of scenarios that cover a bunch of different topics, right? It's not just going to be based on the carbon budget. You have to take different, carbon pricing levels into consideration, physical risks. You will have to do physical, provide baselines for physical risks for all types of asset classes. And I think that will just be an overwhelming task to produce that information. And I think it wouldn't necessarily be helpful for investors. I think it's probably better than to sort of let them gain their own ground, if that is the right expression. Finding their way, I think, is a better discussion, or a better phrase when it comes to picking scenarios. But I mean, the International Energy Agency, 2, 4, and 6 degrees are, super popular. Yeah. I know that we're short on time, Tony.
We are indeed. Do we have any last questions? We had a load more slides for you, but actually it's been much more interesting to have the interaction with you as well.
Thank you. Owen Fahy of KBI Global Investors. Can I talk a little bit about very practical stuff, tools, where you start, that kind of issue for a minute? And I'm coming at it from the point of view of an investment manager, but maybe you could make a shot at also answering it from the point of view of an ordinary corporate. If you're a very large company, very large investor, you have the resources perhaps to devote to this, to do something from the bottom up, to do something proprietary, to start it. But let's say you're the CFO of a small corporate. Let's say you are CFO or some similar executive in a medium or small size investment manager. You clearly don't have the resources to do some sort of quantitative analysis. But you believe that this is important and you'd like to do it. Maybe you want to do it next year. Maybe you're starting next week, next month. Where do you start? What are the tools out there? What are the websites? What are the service providers? I'm sure yourselves. But what are the service providers, the tools, the sites that can help someone get started in terms of quantify? I mean, the subjective, the qualitative approach is fine. Most companies should be able to deal with a lot of that. But in terms of, for example, for an investment manager, some sort of analysis-based, holdings-based analysis of their portfolios. What are the tools and the starting point for analysis to do this at practical, pragmatic level?
So it's an interesting question. I mean, most of the recommendations for the TCFD, and that goes into the scenario analysis, are actually for those bigger organizations rather than for the small and medium-sized organizations. But I guess you're talking from a financial point of view rather than a non-financial SME. I personally think, you've got to actually fit what you can actually do to what your resources are and what the impact's going to be. So if that means that you can only do the qualitative because that's the resources. In terms of the actual tools, there are some tools out there. I think you can probably go into it. I think Jacob's 2 Degree Investing, they have a tool out there that can look at your portfolio as well. It's a developing area, but I think most of it's targeted more at the sort of bigger organizations at the moment because of the resources to do it.
Yeah, I mean, that certainly is true. I think one of the points that we wanted to make with this session is that it isn't necessarily very difficult to start doing it, and I think that to a certain extent applies to the sort of basic quants as well. If you want to do some type of emissions sort of holdings trajectory analysis. Of course, this very much depends on the amount of holdings that you have. Obviously, if you have an absolutely huge portfolio, that will require quite a bit of work. But I think you can pretty easily get an understanding of the at least exposed sectors' primary emissions, if we're looking at scope 1, so combustion, if we're thinking that, if we're just already assuming that the main impact is going to be in the more energy-intensive sectors. And having done that, you can use, publicly available scenarios, those provided by the IPCC. I think the IEA are kind of semi-public. I mean, they're not very difficult or expensive to get a hold of. And then you can look at those companies, your sort of high-risk companies' contribution to that sector and what you should expect from them in different scenarios. So, yeah, I'd probably start there. Go with the low-hanging fruit. So,
because we're nearly out of time, I just wanted to get to I'm going the wrong way.
no, this is the right way.
I wanted to get to there you go. There are some guides out there already, whether it's in the TCFD's technical supplement. We have a technical note in CDP. There's a World Bank paper as well. And there are a number of scenarios that have been done mostly by big sort of extractives out there. Also, there's a tool that the beverage sector are using as well on scenario analysis. I'm not sure that's going to directly address what you're looking for, but this is a developing area. The science of climate-related scenarios isn't necessary, as applied to a portfolio, is still emerging, is still a burgeoning area. So I would probably say stick with the qualitative and look at the tools that are out there at the moment and see if they apply to you and how they can help you.
SASB is pretty great too, right?
Sorry?
SASB? Or
Yeah.
SASB? The sustainability.
SASB.
But I always forget what the acronym stands for. The Sustainability Accounting Board Standards?
It's Sustainability Accounting Standards Board.
Yeah.
Acronym soup.
Yeah,
Acronym
it's quite
soup.
similar.
GRI, DJSI, SASB, CDP, CDSB, TCFD.
You know this stuff.
Anybody got bingo?
So I just wanted to say, so that they also have a climate risk report available online. That's pretty good. If you're just doing like your general sort of sectorial exposure to transition and fiscal risks, I think that's a good way to start, to just find the low-hanging fruit.
Okay, are we out of time? Okay.
6 minutes?
Whole 6 minutes.
This guy.
Just to mention, thanks. Neil Walmsley from Climate-KIC. Just to mention on the useful resources, something that's recently gone live, which I'm not sure how well it's been advertised yet, but Imperial College have just set up a free online open course as a sort of basic introduction to how you can start to go through the process of applying TCFD in practice in your organization. So that might be, I think it's a fairly kind of introductory course, but it's aimed particularly at smaller organizations or non-climate managers, so it's perhaps a good place to start for people if they just want to read up on it at home.
Backed by Climate-KIC, one of our Climate-KIC partners is looking both at CDP data and also tools out and available in the market, and our plan is to put together a report next year on all of the scenarios that are currently being used and available, and that should include tools that are available as well. Any other questions, comments?
One last question.
Should we ask how the group are feeling about TCFD? Are you all ready to go? Oh, one more question.
Just very quickly. I'm from the person from the IDB, and I just wanted to ask, this is mostly applicable to commercial companies. What about sovereign guaranteed debt of multilateral development banks and international finance institutions?
So, from the point of view of what the TCFD was set up to, sorry, I keep getting told I keep going out the light. From the point of view of what the TCFD was set up to do, it was looking at publicly listed companies. So therefore, from that point of view, it was the players involved were really looking at how publicly listed companies could actually disclose. That said, I mean, like if you're a sovereign-owned financial institution, you can report to some of the TCFD recommendations through the UN PRI. Again, I'm doing acronym bingo here. The UN PRI. So as a signatory of the UN PRI, you would actually be disclosing to the TCFD recommendations through their disclosure. So you can do it that way. That's the disclosure, but what I would stress on all of this isn't just about getting organizations to report more. If the TCFD was only set up to get everybody to report more, then it's a bit of a waste of time. And I'm talking that as an organization that thinks disclosure is a very, very good thing. The point of disclosure is, A, to show the transparency of what companies are doing, or sovereign wealth funds or whatever, to show what actions they're taking, but also we found through CDP, through the act of disclosure, a lot of companies are using that to actually change the way they've done things. I speak from a personal point of view. Before I came to CDP, the first thing I did in the environment space was set up an environmental program in it was a FTSE 100 at the time. And out of the back of that, I managed to save the company £32 million and reduce its impact by 23% in 2 years, £32 million over 4 years. I desperately wish I'd actually put a bonus tied to the financial savings. Our annual profit level was £50 million. And one of the things that helped me shape that was knowing what investors were actually going to be asking us. So it really helped me go into the initial program and that startup. I think where disclosure is now, it's not showing where you can actually just get the quick wins. It's showing where you actually need to be going. And that's what disclosure is designing to do.
And just adding on, when you talk about, I mean, debt is not, I mean, when you talk about scenario analysis, it's not necessarily tied to a specific type of funding. It's tied to a specific asset, and that specific asset's risk exposure. So it doesn't, in that end, it doesn't really matter that much where the money is coming from.
Just have one question around materiality, the materiality of this information. If it's material information, it's going to affect the share price, it should be regulated. We haven't really talked about that at all here. Can you sort of speak to that a bit? So,
materiality is one of those issues that's very, very important. If any issue, not just climate related, but any issue, if it's material, it should be disclosed anyway through usual financial accounting. And then should go through the rigorous process that companies should be going through to actually disclose their material issues. So from that point of view, if it is financially material, but the difficulty is with materiality is defining what you mean by it and over what time frame. So some companies take a very short time frame on materiality and say, well, that's my alarm telling me that we're nearly up. So the time frame is an issue. The time frame is definitely an issue in terms of what companies disclose and what is material to them. And as I said, the reporting measures are already in place that they should be saying if it's material. I think that the conflict comes with the fact that we know that as a society, as investors, as long-term investors, we need to know actually if it's material over a longer period, not just the next quarter. And there is that tension in the disclosure to the asset world, because you can't cut a cloth around an investor and say that's what an investor is. You have every spectrum, from those that are looking for very, very quick profits, all the ways to those that are actually saying, well, we're holding these assets because we believe in the long term they will be profitable and we'll ride out the bumps and troughs in between. So that's been part of the difficulty. But having said that, yeah, I agree with you. They should be responding to it. what we're trying to actually bring, I think, through climate-related disclosure is actually this, again, overcoming what Mark Carney said in his Tragedy of Horizon speech. It is all about the fact that actually, if we only look at the short term, then you might not price in this materiality. But if you look longer, and that's what the TCFD are bringing in with look at the long term, look at scenario analysis, what we've brought in through a consortium around science-based targets, how are you actually exposed over that time frame and the longer time frame? And some of the big organizations operate on those time frames and have those assets.
Should we end it there?
I think so. I think that was a really good question to end.
I think it was a fantastic answer as well.
Thank you.